So I just had a discussion with President Lukashenko. This is the first time the president had a discussion with what he called the new media. He's extremely close to President Putin and was very close to President Zelensky. It allowed President Lukashenko, which is the longest serving leader in Europe for over 30 years now, to share his, as honest as he can be considering the circumstances, his view of what caused the war, why we are where we are today, and his expectations from that massive shift we're seeing under President Trump. There's a few things said in the interview that have not been said before. Has President Putin ever regretted the decision to invade in February 2022 now?
Putin had choices too. Perhaps there were alternatives available to him. When he realized the high number of casualties, Putin immediately sought negotiations to halt the conflict. We will find out who is to blame later.
How much blame can we put on President Zelensky? It feels like the guy is just a pawn in a much bigger game.
I feel sorry for him too. I treated him like my own son. We had a very good relationship. We would have been approaching a nuclear confrontation. The election of Trump avoided this extreme scenario, and it seems he is fulfilling his main promises regarding peace.
You played a key role 2 years ago during the Wagner mutiny. Why did Prigozhin stop his advancement? What was the agreement? Is there anything additional you can share?
This is a big question.
My goal is to bridge the gap between the East and the West, because I think the gap is a lot shorter than many people think. Do you agree with my statement? Do you think that bridge is shorter than people think and the media make it out to be?
This is an axiom. This is natural, and not only between the West and the East. In times like today, there should be no bridges between people at all. We must cooperate directly with each other. As for the East, the West, parts of the world, there should be no questions about this. We came up with these things together with you, and all this led to such a bad development of events on our planet.
And I feel like the more I researched yourself and Belarus in preparation for this interview, I kind of felt like Belarus and yourself have acted as that bridge as well. Do you think that with the developments we're seeing now, are we heading in the right direction? And are you more optimistic now in general than you were, let's say, 5 years ago and even 10 years ago? A normalization of relations between Russia and US and NATO, at least similar to the early 2000s. President Putin was the first president to call George Bush after 9/11 to support the US in the Afghanistan war. So that relationship was significantly better, in my view, in the 2000s, to at least go back to those days.
Mario, in politics, apparently, it doesn't happen like this. You don't return to something, and there is no need to do so in the current situation. There is no need to go back. We need to keep moving forward. If we have moved away from that good line, the line that you've mentioned, then we need to get back to this line. But there is no need to return to the past. It is impossible. In politics, it is impossible. Especially now when everything is changing very quickly. The times are turbulent. There is no need to go back anywhere. We need to look forward and move forward. Who could think? You talked about the United States, about Russia, and so on. Who could have thought that the situation can change so quickly between the East and the West, between the US and the rest of the world, including between the US and Russia? Nobody could have guessed, but one person who took the risk, Donald Trump, very quickly changed the situation. He changed it back to normal. Let's hope so. Therefore, I want to repeat once again that I am not a supporter of any return to anything. We need to move forward in accordance with the situation that is developing. As for bridges, as you've called it, I want you to understand my position. The thing I hate most is mediation. It means being between someone and someone else and pretending that you can do something there, especially to be a mediator between the US and Russia or the US and China and so on. We have excellent relations with Russia and China, but God forbid that we should be some kind of mediator between these giants. In order to be a mediator, as the situation is showing today, you need to have a powerful resource or something else. I am not capable of this. I am a supporter of sincere politics. Therefore, if I can help somewhere, organize something, push some process, if it is within my power and within the power of my state, Belarus, I would do so with great pleasure, but only to make things better for the people. I have great optimism here in connection with the policies of the current administration of the United States of America. They are doing a great job, and Trump is doing a great job. He often speaks and does something to end the war in Ukraine, to end the war in the Middle East. This is worth a lot in foreign policy. I think he has no other policy than to stop the war. It is a brilliant idea. This is where I am ready to back them and do whatever is necessary to end the war and improve people's lives. It's not normal when young guys like you, Mario, are dying at the front today. Is this normal? While the majority of society lives more or less normally, in a certain part of society lives quite well, and some people die for some interests. This is not normal. So I have great optimism about this, but I would in no way want to be some kind of mediator, especially in normalization of relations in Ukraine. It won't happen. If someone needs me, or if those who are in charge of resolving this issue show interest in Belarus, we are always ready for this. But we won't get involved in this showdown. We have already been there once. It took place here in the Palace of Independence. Negotiations between Russia and the West took place here. So what? It turns out that representatives of the major Western states, Germany and France, who represented the European Union, and the Americans supported them, came to deceive Russia. They talked about this later. Well, that's a lie. That's not true at all. Back then, everything wasn't like that. Everything was serious, and no one was going to deceive anyone. But then the situation changed, and Hollande and Merkel had to jump on the bandwagon and say that they played the main role. And so Ukraine was given time to prepare an army for a war with Russia. This is a lie. Well, it happens in politics. Well, just for your information, so that you understand what happened here and the position of these major politicians.
One thing that fascinates me as someone that's extremely close to President Putin, and you're in a tricky position because you're close to Russia, your number one ally, and close to Ukraine, who was your number one trading partner. Can you tell me more about the days prior to the invasion? Any calls you've had with President Putin, any calls you've had with Zelensky? How were those discussions like? Anything you can share, because now it's been 4 years.
You know, Mario, there were many details, and off the cuff, it's hard for me to even remember all these details. I just want to focus on very important details. Some moments. Now, all of us, and especially you, representatives of the media, are immersed in the search for reasons. Look for who is to blame for starting this conflict. My understanding comes from other positions. We will find out who is to blame later. No one will escape responsibility. We will discuss in detail and understand the reasons for this. This is not the main issue on the agenda today. And here I would like to once again emphasize the position of the current administration of the United States. It is only thanks to this administration that the issue of ending the war has become so urgent. But I spoke about this back when the negotiations were taking place here. The Minsk agreements were signed. After all this, I said that we would not be able to achieve any peace. Even before the war started, at that time it was about the conflict that started in 2014 in Donbass. I said back then that this issue cannot be resolved without the United States of America. Everything will depend on the position that the United States and its closest allies take. But look, that's what happened. Would the conflict in Ukraine flare up if the U.S., England, and other Western countries had not supported this war by supplying weapons to Ukraine? This conflict would not have happened. While someone needed this war. And only with Donald Trump coming to power, the question of ending the war was put bluntly. And he said directly what he could do and what would happen if the war doesn't stop. He said it correctly. You know this. That is why this is the main thing today, and not to search for the guilty. Well, let's keep looking for the guilty for another 2 years until another million of people on both sides die. Do we need this? No, we need to stop the conflict. We need to make sure that they stop shooting at the first stage. They should stop shooting at each other. After all, it is brothers who shoot at each other. These people are brothers. The Ukrainians and Russians are brothers. Today in Russia, more than 1 million, or even significantly more than that, perhaps 5 million Ukrainians are living. There are mixed marriages. Well, there are not many Russians left in Ukraine because they were simply expelled from there. But there are still quite a lot of them. But they are the same. We are monitoring the situation at the front, and we hear the Russians and Ukrainians saying, "We are fighting well." They are fighting well. Why? Because we graduated from the same military academies. This is how the military think on one side and on the other. They understand that they came from the same cradle, and it so happened that they are fighting against each other today. So this needs to be stopped. And here we are on the same page with the Americans. We must do everything for this. What was going on then? Recently, I noticed something. I will turn to Trump again. He reproached Vladimir Zelensky for having 3 years to stop the war. He asked, "Why didn't you do it?" Very well said. These 3 years. From the beginning, it was necessary to stop this war. When the conflict began, literally a few weeks later, I think, here in Belarus, there was the first round of negotiations. I was very keen to get these negotiations started, and I suggested having them in Belarus. The Ukrainians and Russians met in Gomel. Then they didn't like something, changed their mind and said they wanted to meet in the West. In Belovezhskaya Pushcha, 2 rounds took place there. We did everything for them to sit down at the negotiating table. Then the Ukrainians probably didn't like Belarus at all, and they went to Istanbul. It was their last meeting. And there was a certain result, which Putin often mentions. There was a corresponding document. It was much more advantageous than the situation now. Back then, I publicly kept pushing the Ukrainian leadership to the fact that it was necessary to make peace. It was necessary to agree. They said, "No, we will fight until the last Ukrainian." And the West pushed Ukraine towards this. Well, so they are fighting until the last Ukrainian. Several million people fled Ukraine. And in America, you claim that about 1 million are dead or injured on the Ukrainian side. So, well, there is nothing good in this. But in the first days of this war, I called Zelensky. I won't talk about the circumstances. I called him and told him the following. He spoke for a long time explaining why the war began. Moreover, by then he'd believed Belarus to be an aggressor together with Russia. He was screaming and shouting. I listened to him and then asked him a question in a friendly manner. Volodya, tell me, please, in what land is the war taking place? On what territory? It is in your Ukraine. Therefore, as president, you will be responsible for this. You are responsible for not preventing the war and for the fact it is taking place on the territory of Ukraine. The second thing I told him was, who is to blame? I often give this example. I said, before that, let's not talk about Donbass. In Odessa, the nationalist forces of Ukraine burned several dozen people alive in the House of Trade Unions. They were Russians, Russian-speaking people. They have always lived in Ukraine. Why did they burn these people alive? All this kept being ramped up. The Russian language was suppressed. Russian-speaking people, and there were millions of them in the West, were facing oppression. Ukraine started to oppress them. And I asked the question, imagine if in Mexico, in the north of Mexico, let's say, the Mexicans treated the citizens of the United States of America in a similar way. What would happen? Any U.S. administration, at the demand of the U.S. public, would sweep Mexico from the face of the earth into the Gulf or America, or the Gulf of Mexico. Right? Well, the public started to demand from Putin to defend Russian-speaking people in Ukraine who were being offended by the authorities. There are many other reasons Putin defended them. So what claims can you make against him? I say there were other reasons for this. The Russian authorities talk about them. Security guarantees for Russia from NATO in the USA. He publicly asked for guarantees. No such guarantees were given. So the situation developed in such a way that the West, to some extent, especially Western European countries, pushed the leadership of Ukraine towards this war. As for reasons, there will always be one. A reason was found. But the main thing, Musk is right to start this audit of the spending of U.S. funds. USAID was closed and so on. What were they doing? They funded coups in countries. More than $5 billion, and that what is known so far was sent to Ukraine in order to carry out the Maidan. For what? We experienced the same thing in 2020. The unrest in Belarus was financed from these sources. That's how it happened. That's why initially we took a friendly position in this conflict. I am often asked if I knew that this war would start in February 3 years ago. No, I didn't know. But if I had known, I would not have defended Ukraine then. Because at that moment, we were already at war with Ukraine. Belarus and Ukraine, an economic war. Economic war. Ukraine imposed sanctions against us earlier than the Americans in Western Europe. The border was closed. They seized thousands of our railway freight cars with goods. They still haven't returned them. And about 1,000 heavy-duty trucks. They arrested 75 of our citizens, drivers who worked on these vehicles. And I had to carry out a special operation in order to get them out of there. They killed 3 of them and mutilated their bodies so that we would not understand how it happened. So why should I have defended Ukraine? That is, Ukraine escalated relations with Belarus earlier than the Americans and the entire West. So there is nothing to blame us for. But nevertheless, we spoke out against the war. We wanted peace. That was our position. And I emphasize once again, in the first days of the war, I called Zelensky and told him all this. The third thing I told him was, a new administration will come to power in the United States and policy will change. Nobody will support you in the war. And that's what happened. Everything was predicted, not because I am a great foreteller, but everything I said and everything was in the media. There is a corresponding recording. All of this happened. Here are some small details. If we talk about the reasons, about who is to blame, these are just a few points. When the time comes, we will discuss this. But today, we have to stop the war.
There's talking about the causes of the war, which I want to move on. There's one quote that President Putin said in 2017. I want to get your thoughts on it. He said, I have met with 3 US presidents. They all had their own ideas, but the decisions were made by men in dark suits. Have you had a discussion with President Putin about this concept? And you've kind of alluded to those people that pressured Ukraine to start the war and pushed Ukraine for the war. Who makes those decisions from your experience?
No, that's how it was. I didn't want to talk about it anymore. The man is not in office anymore. But this was done publicly. In Istanbul, when the process of concluding peace agreements was moving forward, the then Prime Minister of England arrived there, Boris Johnson. It was public. He forbade Zelensky to pursue peace. He pushed Zelensky once again towards war. Why am I saying this? I know very well how this backstage machinations work in the West. Johnson would have never done this on his own without being pushed by the then U.S. administration. Therefore, I am absolutely convinced that Great Britain and the Biden administration were involved in the next round of escalation in Ukraine. I am absolutely convinced of this. This was a coordinated position of the Americans and the British, which Johnson expressed when he came there.
Did you speak to President Putin when that happened, when those peace negotiations fell through in Istanbul? And what were those discussions like? I'm always fascinated by the discussions behind the curtains, not what we see on TV. So whatever you could share there would be great.
We were in constant contact. We exchanged opinions on this matter. Moreover, when on the day when the issues were discussed in Istanbul, they were put on paper. And Putin gave me these documents.
And I want to go back to that quote of the men in black suits that President Putin referred to. For me, it implies that the president isn't really the one that was making the decisions, and I think that was most true with President Biden. How much change has President Trump brought to the system that might have played a role in getting us here, which I think played a role in getting us here? And it's hard to define what that system is, but it feels like President Trump has fundamentally changed how things operate on the West.
Recently, in a very, very narrow circle, one might say, family circle, listening to the latest statements by Trump, Musk, and others, I said that these guys, Trump, Musk, and others, they appear the most often in the media. I said that they have not yet recovered from this pre-election mayhem. The elections were very difficult in the United States of America. Both Putin and I, you know this very well, of course, supported Trump. When Trump allegedly lost to Biden in the last elections, I said publicly in the parliament, literally a few days later, that this was unfair. Biden didn't defeat Trump then. Then the trials began. Not only were those who stormed the Capitol convicted, but Trump himself was dragged through the courts. I was regularly making statements that this is not democracy at all. It is something terrible. And after everything that happened in the U.S., supporting Trump publicly, this can be verified. I didn't think he would win. And when he won, I said directly that he went through the United States of America like a bulldozer and won. Unbelievable. This is an incredible person. And the incredible happened. The fact he was nearly shot, he's right. Perhaps God saved him. But if it was the Lord who saved him, then he saved him for a reason. And not only many people on our planet, but the Lord also sees what you're doing now in the United States of America. He takes note. And God forbid you don't do what he expects. Our Lord, you have made a lot of good steps and statements, very good actions and statements. Nothing monstrous. We understand this. We Belarusians have gone through that. But this is Belarus. You want to see where was the American money spent under Biden? You want to see how corrupt Washington elites and officials are. There is nothing wrong with that. I welcome this. This is right. You announced normalization of relations in the Gaza Strip, in the Middle East. You want to stop wars, conflicts. Trump said that he doesn't want to send his guys anywhere abroad anymore, to overthrow some regimes and so on. That's brilliant. The whole world dreams of this. But I must tell you, I also recently said this to a small circle as a joke. There in America they could do with someone like me. I would tell Trump straight to his face that he can't do, no, how he shouldn't do things. There are too many statements that weren't necessary at all. It wasn't necessary to voice them. Well, for example, it is very important. Recently, together with Musk, they published a video, I think on the X platform, right? They published a video about how they will make the residents of the Gaza Strip happy. Everyone will be evicted from there, distributed among some countries, etc. Listen, firstly, it's unrealistic. And secondly, even if you wanted to build something there, you shouldn't have talked about it in such a way. You shouldn't promote yourself there on some platform and create some videos. In politics, this is unacceptable. It is a mistake. And the current administration makes many such mistakes in form, not in content, but in form. You need to cool off. In the U.S. today, calm down. Do what you have voiced. You have said a lot of good things, but most importantly, you must deal with the internal problems of the United States of America. During the election campaign, you made a lot of promises to people, to voters, to 320 million people. If you don't make any progress within a year, if, well, at least some % of your promises are not fulfilled, terrible, turbulent times await you. Even your fellow party members will refuse to trust you. This is possible. There is enough jealousy towards Trump. There are a lot of jealous people who can't stand Trump. But they understand that Trump was elected by people. 2 houses of parliament are dominated by Republicans. But hopes are very high. You have to live up to these hopes. Step by step, live up to these hopes, step by step. Currently, it's not there. There is a piling up of statements. We will do this, we want this, we want that. But what about the result? And time is running out quickly. Therefore, the biggest mistake is to pile up these statements. Shocking, unnecessary statements. Politics does not like noise. Yes, sometimes you need to say something for the sake of populism, but this can be done during the election campaign. Trump has already done it. Today the results are needed, and you can produce these results, but you are not producing them. The worst thing for you is if the people of the U.S. become disappointed. Or, let's say frankly speaking, it is beneficial to me, it is to our advantage that the United States of America have clashes with the European Union. But the question arises from the American point of view. Why are you doing it this way? Do it calmly. There is no need to fly into a temper. You don't need smoke screens. Do it quietly, don't make noise. These are your allies. They did whatever you told them to do. Or let's say in relation to Ukraine. Well, what is this statement about 4% for Zelensky? Well, Zelensky never had 4%. He had 14 to 17%. He has now not 57%, as he says, but 14 to 17%. This is his rating. He will lose these elections. Why making statements about 4%, giving away the mineral wealth and other things? These issues need to be resolved calmly. You are not only a media representative, but also a businessman. As far as I know, you never make noise when it comes to money or business. You never make noise. Money is made in silence. Why this noise? That was the first point. Secondly, when this war began, was it agreed that in exchange for the supply of weapons and support, Zelensky would give up rare earth metals? There was no talk about this. So what can you demand from him today? It is beneficial for us. The fact that you showed Zelensky at his place, he should have known about it. But if we speak sincerely, honestly, and objectively, then your position here is not strong, and everything would be fine. Zelensky is not going anywhere, but the whole world today is looking at the United States of America. And the last thing I would advise Trump, it is not necessary to attack China out of the blue. You need to come to an agreement with China. I know China very well. I have known China for more than 30 years. China has developed before my eyes. You can't stop China. It's not us. It's not Russia. This is China. The people are built differently there. 1.5 billion people are eager to defend China until the last man standing. China is a high-tech country. They do everything. They even produce oxygen in space. Russia, America, and India don't have this. It is a very high-tech country. If you want to suffer defeat, then you will build relations with China in a high-handed manner. Find agreement with the Chinese. It will be in the interests of the entire planet. And don't think of pulling Russia closer to you so that Russia and China damage their relations. This will never happen. President Putin and the Russian leadership understand who remain their friends in difficult times. That is, there are many such moments that the American politicians should talk to Trump about. But you don't do it because you're afraid of him. Trump is a tough person by nature, and you're afraid of this. There's no need to be afraid. You sometimes need to act like Musk, directly and openly. I will do this, I will not do that. This is right, this is wrong. You need to discuss this openly. there, in the United States, and it must be done correctly in form. It turns out that in terms of content, it seems like you want to do a good deed, but as soon as you start talking, well, sometimes it's not very pleasant even to listen to. This is the United States of America after all. Sorry for intruding on these things at your suggestion, but this is very important. But you need to cool down. You need to cool down after the elections. In the interests of the U.S. voters, first of all. And secondly, in the interests of the entire world community, you need to take steps that will be welcomed by the entire international community, and first of all, by the Americans. You have little time to prove to American society that you are capable of something. If you do this, then next term for J.D. Vance or someone else is yours. If you don't do this, the Republicans will suffer a crushing defeat in the next elections, and this will be deserved.
Okay, before my question, I want to respectfully correct you on one thing. You've referred to me as legacy media on, I think, two or three occasions. I think you're used to legacy media asking you, like Steve, asking you the same question again and again and again. But I think my questions are not going to be any gotcha questions. So the legacy media hates me as well. So I'd want to make that correction before I ask my next question. So the legacy media hates me.
You know, Mario, you can ask any questions. I have one strict rule in relation to media representatives. If you agree to talk to the journalist, this means you have to tolerate him and answer all his questions. So you can ask any questions, maybe even the ones like Steve, although I don't think about him. Believe me, I know him. You see our question and answer relationship in the public space, but I know him a little bit more. I was interested in him. I have such an opportunity, having become interested, to know more about him. That's why I don't think about him.
I like watching him and Steve on video. It's funny. My question though, you did comment on something important. You said President Putin would never move away from China. And I think there was a comment by General Keith Kellogg, who's Trump's envoy for Ukrainian negotiations, who said that the US must try to break up the axis, which includes Iran, Russia, China, North Korea. But most importantly, I think Russia and China. Is there any possibility or any world in the next 5 to 10 years where China and Russia kind of move away a bit further and Russia moves more towards the US with the developments that we're seeing under Trump? Is there that possibility that Russia moves closer to the US?
Anything can happen in this life, so I won't deny it. It is quite possible. But Putin, in the current leadership of Russia, will not pursue a policy to break, as you said, some axis. Putin is a man who acts in the interests of his own people. For him, the interests of the people are above all else. I talk to him often asking why something is this or that way. He told me this many times. Even when all arguments run out, he puts the interests of Russia and the interests of the Russian people first. The interests of the Russian people. The territory is huge. The population is quite small. Half of that of the U.S., maybe less. It is in the interests of Russia and the Russian peoples to maintain friendly relations with their neighbors. China is a neighbor. North Korea is a neighbor. Neighbors are not chosen. Neighbors are from God, and you need to build normal relationships with them. You understand? As for the United States of America, it is the first country in the world. It is a high-tech, rich country. They are capable of many things. Many things. They understand this in Russia, and Russia will seek to establish very good relations with the United States of America. Let's be honest, these sanctions that were imposed against us in Russia have shown that a lot depends on the United States of America. This is also understood in Russia, and Putin understands it, and the entire leadership of Russia. Therefore, Russia will try to improve relations with China, Korea, and Iran. Russia has good relations with them. Russia has close relations with China, for example. But in this regard, I will ask you one rhetorical question. Who united Russia with China? It is you, is it? You pushed them into each other's arms. When I met here with Bolton and Pompeo, they came here, I asked them directly, "What are you doing? Why do you denigrate Russia? You are pushing Russia into the arms of China. It is such a powerful country, military-wise, a nuclear power equal to the United States. If this country with a powerful military unites with such a powerful state as China, economically, you will not be able to do anything with this union, with this alliance. But then you put pressure on Iran, rejecting the deal. That was Trump who did it during his first term. Then you started putting pressure on North Korea. But where could they go? So you united them.
What did Bolton say when you asked him that question?
He agreed with me. He agreed with me, but that's how it happened. And what about him? What else could he do? You have imposed sanctions. Russia is a huge country. It holds a leading position in the energy sector. They needed foreign currency revenue and similar resources. Therefore, Russia began to seek opportunities, not in the West, but in the East, particularly in Asia, and such an opportunity was found. Therefore, today it is impossible to separate Russia from China or to sever their relationship. That won't work. If the Americans act aggressively here, using this brute force, not military force, Trump will not go to war with either China or Russia. He understands the potential consequences. In that sense, he is a smart person. However, if you pressure Russia in an attempt to damage its relations with China, it will lead nowhere. On the contrary, it will only strengthen the ties between these countries. Careful and delicate work is needed, but everywhere the focus should be on peaceful negotiations.
I made a post on X, an unpopular opinion after my interview with Prime Minister Fico, and I said, I think in the next 10 years or sooner, the US and Russia will not only normalize relations, but I think there's a possibility they could be allies again. They were allies 80 years ago. Your thoughts on that statement? What would you say is the probability? Or are we past the point of no return and those days are over for another generation?
That's definitely possible. Nothing is impossible in life. That's the first point. Secondly, Russia will always be your ally. It remains one of the most powerful military nations. But not against anyone in particular. You and Russia can unite against a common adversary only if that adversary poses a threat to both Russia and you. Currently, Russia has no enemies. In the United States of America, by and large, has no enemies either. Thus, for the world to maintain balance and avoid confusing conflicts, like those in the Middle East or Ukraine, for conflicts not to happen, this alliance of the United States and Russia is possible and important. Alliance would be crucial for economic development. It is both possible and important. This will take some time. In this respect, you are correct.
Do you think President Putin would also agree? Does he still want a positive relationship with the US as he did in the early 2000s?
The Russian leadership has an interest in fostering positive and friendly relations with the United States of America. This is beneficial not only for Russia, but also for the United States. Very beneficial. We'll take this small example. Right now, you are debating with Ukraine over rare earth metals and so on. Well, listen, Russia ranks second in the world. China ranks first in terms of rare earth metal possession. There are plenty of these rare earth materials in a more accessible form. Cooperate with Russia. You will achieve colossal benefits. While Russia may gain less from this partnership, you would experience substantial growth and development. So why are you trying to enter Ukraine through a window? The front door for cooperation is open with Russia. Putin said so. They are interested in this. Even the territories that were once Ukrainian and now joined Russia are rich in rare earth materials, which are already largely controlled by Russia. Therefore, you just need to negotiate and cooperate. There is no need to pressure Zelensky at this moment, regardless of his position. You should aim to persuade him to reach an agreement because a significant portion of Ukrainian society supports Zelensky. Therefore, you need to come to an agreement. If you're interested, come. Kiev is located just 200 kilometers from the border, from the Belarusian border. It's about 500 kilometers away from here, which is a half-hour flight. Let's sit down quietly, without any noise or shouting. Let's come to an agreement. Please tell Trump that I am here, waiting him with Putin and Zelensky. We'll have a calm discussion and come to an understanding, if you want to negotiate.
I think they do now. It's crazy that President Biden and President Putin didn't even have a call for years. Like, I just don't understand how politics could work like this in this age.
Well, there is nothing surprising about that. Joe Biden is not Trump. Trump is more independent. Even if it is wrong, he will make a decision. Biden himself did not make the decisions. Well, they told him not to call. He didn't call. He was told to call Putin a dictator. He called him a dictator. Say that Putin is a murderer. Look, but he had a bunch of advisors, military advisors in the Pentagon, those dealing with foreign relations issues. Blinken, the former Secretary of State, the leading figures and the ones like them. Moreover, there were people sitting there in the State Department who looked at Blinken's mouth and said what Blinken said. A huge army was being created that was pushing Joe Biden in a certain direction. Well, maybe you really do have some masterminds or an organization somewhere that has been exerting influence over the president. Well, I think that these could be industrial groups, military industrial groups, who also had their own interests. That's why they were putting pressure on Biden. Well, Biden, due to his character and his physical condition, could not resist this pressure the way Trump does. That's the whole problem.
That's a very good point. And for me, I also feel very, and you might disagree, but I feel very bad for President Zelensky. He seemed like a very courageous man, the way he responded to the war. I think he made mistakes that led us here. Not blaming him fully, but I think he played a role among many other people. But would you agree in that President Zelensky was really in a difficult position, and if it was up to him, if he was making the decisions, we wouldn't be having a war for so many years? Would you agree with that statement? How much blame can we put on President Zelensky? Because it feels like the guy is just a pawn in a much bigger game.
I understand your empathy for Zelensky. I feel sorry for him, too. I treated him like my own son. We had a very good relationship. I was in Ukraine. We held negotiations with Zelensky. He struck me as an intelligent man. However, there were things he didn't fully grasp at the time. These were his first steps in office. He would ask me questions like, how do you handle this? What will this person do? What should be done? Our relationship was warm and friendly. But however, the fact that he yielded to the influence of extreme nationalist forces is unfortunate. But it's clear that he probably had no one to rely on at the very beginning. He was trying to navigate a difficult situation, and at that time the nationalists in Ukraine held significant power. So he clearly sided with the strong. But there was no need for that. He made several mistakes due to his inexperience back then. When a person is inexperienced, it's important not to rush. Think carefully before taking any action. Talk to someone and seek advice. He had people to consult with. But ultimately, what matters most is the interests of your voters and the people of Ukraine. You made many promises to the Ukrainian people. The most important promise was to bring an end to the war. But in fact, he did everything to stoke the fire of the war. He escalated this conflict to an extraordinary level. Yes, there were mistakes made, but he was also pushed towards this. I've mentioned this before. From this perspective, I completely agree with your viewpoint. I feel sorry for him too, but this doesn't happen in politics. One must take responsibility for their people and their country. But your policy has led to the destruction of this state and to the impoverishment of the very people to whom you made promises.
Another question I want to ask you is, has there ever been regret? And I feel like the answer is yes. I don't know if you could say that, but like, has President Putin ever regretted the decision to invade in February 2022 now? Even though you might look at it like some might see it like he had no choice with NATO's expansion, but was that really the right decision? And did you think it was the right decision?
Look, there is always a choice. Putin had choices too. Perhaps there were alternatives available to him. The issue isn't solely about NATO's eastward expansion, but rather the threats that emerged in Ukraine. While NATO expanded eastward, he did not respond by attacking Belarus. He did not attack Belarus. This too could have been a reaction to NATO's expansion. Instead, he chose to attack Ukraine. Attack is how you usually call this. Why did he do that? Because he saw threats coming from Ukraine, and those threats were publicly directed at him. This is one of the significant reasons behind what transpired. Regarding your second question about whether he regretted his actions, it seems to me that Putin, we haven't discussed this, but I do know him well. Putin didn't consider the possibility of such a war occurring. If he had thought that would be the outcome, he wouldn't have engaged in negotiations. When he realized the high number of casualties, Putin immediately sought negotiations to halt the conflict, to reach an agreement. To reach an agreement concerning NATO, demilitarization, denazification, as he said, ensuring that Russians would not be harmed, so that the Russian language would not be suppressed in Ukraine. This was part of the agenda. He wanted to negotiate once he realized how things had escalated. It seems he likely only regretted the situation because it turned into such a full-scale conflict, into a war that he probably did not anticipate.
It feels like we live in a different world to a few months ago where we have conversations, I think frank conversations. People are saying things that they wouldn't usually say. And I feel like the entire paradigm has shifted. Let's go to what's going on right now with the minerals agreement. Are we heading in the right direction for peace? And can you tell me more about your recent discussions with President Putin as well? Is he happy with the progress that's happening? And also, if you can comment, I'm not sure if you've spoken to President Putin, I'm sure you have, regarding his recent call with President Trump as well. How was that call? And, well, should we be optimistic based on these developments?
Only in general terms, both regarding the conversation with Trump and the negotiations in Saudi Arabia, as well as the topic of rare earth materials. Just general things. Why? Because we'll meet in Moscow in a week, and we will discuss all issues in great detail. That's what we mentioned over the phone, that we would meet and go over everything thoroughly. So we only touched on the broad outlines. Concerning these rare earth materials, I raised the question, saying it's strange that the Americans are demanding that Ukraine provide them with the resources of utmost importance, which include more than just rare earth materials. The discussions also touch on natural gas, oil, on logistics, including ports and so on. There is a broader question here. I conveyed this message to Putin. He said something like, "It's as if the Americans are knocking on an open door. We have everything in Russia. We can reach an agreement with them and collaborate." And then he announced it publicly, as for rare earth materials. As for the agreement on Ukraine, he once again confirmed his stance. And I know his position, he said. We are in favor of it. We are ready to sit down at the negotiating table to discuss Ukraine. If it concerns Ukraine, then we talk with the Ukrainians. He then mentioned that the Ukrainians, particularly Zelensky, are upset about not being invited to Saudi Arabia. Why reach out if there were questions about Russia and the USA? The issues concerning Ukraine were only briefly mentioned during those negotiations. So why was it necessary to involve Ukraine? But Trump has already addressed this matter. When Ukraine's issues are being resolved, I believe that no one will resolve these issues without Ukraine.
Do you think that increasing the incentives that the US has in Ukraine with this deal, could that be seen as a threat? Because now the US has more interest in Ukraine if that deal goes through, which is about to be signed in a few days. So could that be seen as a threat to Russia? Also, the comments by, I think, France and the UK about sending peacekeeping force as well to Belarus. What are your thoughts on that? Not to Belarus, to Ukraine, because could that be seen as a threat as well to Russia? So you got the peacekeeping force and increased interests, US interests in Ukraine.
Regarding the last question you asked at the end about France and Germany sending peacekeeping forces, Russia will never agree to this. At least, that is Russia's position today. Furthermore, the leaders of the European Union, primarily represented by Germany and France, are currently taking a very aggressive stance. I don't know if Trump succeeded in the negotiations with Macron, Starmer, to persuade them towards peace and peaceful negotiations. However, they are indeed adopting a very aggressive position on the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. Therefore, Russia is categorically against any peacekeeping forces from European states. The first question was about
the risk of US interests in Ukraine.
Yes, concerning the agreements of the United States and with Ukraine. This may be alarming for Russia, and most likely it is. I think so. I have not discussed these matters with Russia, with Putin, yet. We will discuss this issue with Putin, but it may very well be a cause for concern. If Russia perceives that these agreements extend beyond economic relations, if they are purely economic, and not linked to the military-industrial complex, weapons, armed forces, then why not? Russia will stay calm. Yes, it is indeed unsettling that a powerful nation like the United States will be developing minerals and establishing its own enterprises right at our doorstep, just outside your window. Yes, it's not that nice. It could have been you, but it's not you. Well, Russia will endure. Russia is vast and has ample resources.
I want to ask you a question that I'm personally fascinated by, unrelated to everything we've discussed, and probably one you're not expecting. You played a key role 2 years ago during the Wagner mutiny. You were having discussions with Prigozhin, with President Putin, ending the advancement towards Moscow. I remember covering the story very closely for 24 hours live. It's a very scary day for the world, in my opinion, but it's one not talked about. It's been 2 years. What can you tell us about that day? Again, that's a personal question that I'm really fascinated by. What can you tell us? What were those discussions like? Why did Prigozhin stop his advancement? What was the agreement? Is there anything additional you can share from 2 years ago?
You know, this is a big question. In fact, my actions were appreciated by the West, surprisingly even by the CIA and MI16, along with other intelligence agencies. They appreciated it greatly. Why? It is not customary to talk about this publicly. However, the West took notice. I felt that too at the time. As the process unfolded, I sensed it as well. At that time, Zhenya Prigozhin was rushing toward the nuclear button, and the West assumed that he could potentially overthrow the existing government at that time and seize nuclear weapons. This is what they privately thanked me for. I came to this realization in the middle of the day, not immediately. I never imagined that Zhenya Prigozhin could descend into such madness. I had known him well for a long time, and we had maintained a good relationship. But to reach this point, it stems from his inexperience. He should have understood that it wasn't just about Russia. The Russians, as well as the Americans and the British, would destroy him. They would not allow him to gain access to nuclear weapons. This is a fact. But he didn't grasp that. He went straight to Moscow. We had a talk with Putin. When he left Rostov, we talked. I won't go into details there. That's a separate, extensive discussion. I realized that the situation was serious. Initially, I didn't disclose my actions to him right away. I asked him, "Let me think it over and I'll call you back." I needed to assess what we could do. Once I gathered all the necessary information, I concluded that I had to intervene. If Zhenya Prigozhin would not agree with my perspective during the negotiations, and we were in contact, I would have been compelled to mobilize my most combat-ready units and send them to defend Moscow. I called Putin and confirmed that I would be prepared. Send planes. We would transfer our special forces and special operations forces to Moscow to protect the city. I realized in the middle of the day that this situation was very serious. And I called Prigozhin again. Our conversation has recently been published, but it is twisted. Artificial intelligence does work after all. My opponents in the West published the conversation, twisted it, and added their own interpretations. But essentially, we had a conversation, and I managed to convince Prigozhin that he would not achieve his goals. I told him, Zhenya, we have solid relations, but you need to understand these are high-level interstate relations. Please don't take offense, but I am transferring my Special Forces units to defend Moscow. I communicated this to him. I asked him to think it over and provide me with a response. I will do everything possible to ensure that you are not subject to criminal prosecution. I will ask Putin to close the criminal case. At the time, Putin announced that a criminal case would be opened against the rebels. Well, there were other promises as well, and I will take you to Belarus and station you in Belarus. After some time, we had another phone call, he agreed, and they were already passing near Belarus, naturally heading towards Moscow. And then they turned around and went to Belarus. I stationed more than 1,000 of them, maybe about 2,000 people. I stationed them in Belarus. Well, that's just basically it. And there were a lot of details there. This is how this conflict ended.
That day made me realize how fragile the world we live in is. And I want to bring that fragility to how close some people saw us to getting into a nuclear war during the last 3 years. As someone who was close to Zelensky and who's very close to President Putin, you probably have a better idea than most of us in the West on how close President Putin was to pressing the red button, just in some capacity. How close were we, sir?
I don't believe that Putin was placed in a situation where he felt he had to press the red button. At least we didn't discuss this issue directly, but indirectly, we could see where things were heading. Putin never indicated that he was ready for extreme measures. I don't think he was prepared to press the red button. He was as ready to press the red button as you were ready for this in the United States of America, in England, or France. I know you weren't prepared for this. Putin was not ready for this either. Putin is convinced that there are currently no significant reasons to unleash a nuclear war, and he understands better than anyone what the consequences could be. Therefore, I can say with absolute certainty that Putin had never held a remote control with a red button in his hands in order to press this red button a few minutes later. If aggression is committed against Belarus and Russia, then all methods of response will be employed. And in no case is it a fact that it will start with a nuclear confrontation using, say, tactical nuclear weapons. For example, if there is an attack on Belarus from the West, like from Poland or another place, and we have an agreement on the defense the Belarus and Russia, this does not mean that we will use nuclear weapons tomorrow. There are many other diplomatic and military methods available, traditional weapons and so on. For example, Oreshnik and other weapons, but no one will reach for the nuclear button. But if the threat becomes extreme, then this weapon exists to be used. The United States of America will do exactly the same.
What about the nuclear warheads here in Belarus that were moved there a few months ago?
Do you know what is very important? I apologize for interrupting you. On a purely human level, why am I happy that Trump was elected? In a situation where we have really already started talking about nuclear war, why did they elect Trump? Trump has a large family. He has many young children and grandchildren. Yes, he does. His son with Melania Trump is still very young, probably about 20 years old.
Eric, Don Jr., Baron.
Baron. Yes, he is very young. He is probably the same age as my Kolya, my youngest son. And they are somewhat similar to each other.
Your youngest son is 19, yes?
He is 20. So I'm glad he was elected because he has children, and I see that he loves his family very much. His big family, his children, grandchildren, and so on. He loves them dearly. A person who has love for children and family, it seems to me, would never press the red button.
What about President Xi Jinping? You've met the president of China multiple times. What's his stance on the war? Because he's been very, very tactical and not as vocal about what's been going on.
Yes. As I mentioned before, Xi Jinping and I are on good terms. Of course, it's not the same relationship as with Putin. Xi Jinping is a bit further away, but we've known each other for a long time. He wasn't even the president yet. Our relationship is quite open. I can say this with absolute certainty. Not only doesn't Xi Jinping want war, he doesn't escalation of relations. He doesn't need confrontation. That is inherent in the Chinese. It's in the blood. They will quietly and calmly explore their options and take action. They understand that in this silence, they can succeed, and they do succeed. They are completely opposed to war, and we discuss Ukraine. They express support for peace in Ukraine. Do you remember a Chinese and Brazilian initiative for peace talks? But to be honest, the Chinese were not as deeply immersed in this conflict as, say, the Americans. They were willing to do everything but didn't know how to proceed. They were uncertain about what actions to take. They tried to carefully declare that they were ready to do everything for peace, but at that time, there was nothing specific for this process. They didn't know exactly how to approach it or what steps to take. So I know for sure that it is in China's interests for this conflict to be resolved. This conflict was not needed because their Belt and Road Initiative, the Silk Road, passed through Ukraine towards Western Europe. But there is the front now, there is war. This has caused some damage to Chinese economic interests. Therefore, China did not need war.
I'm aware you have an important call in 14 minutes, so I've got not too many questions left. By the way, my team allowed me permission to ask you. They said you have an important call in 14 minutes. I said, do you think I can ask the president what that important call is? They said, sure, you can ask. So I'm going to ask you, what is the important call you have in 14 minutes?
Who is the phone call with? With Putin. We agreed yesterday that we would talk about the modalities of my official visit to Russia. This is my first official visit after the elections, and we have agreed that we will talk about certain details during our meeting on the 13th and 14th. Yes? On March 13th, 14th, and 15th, I will be in Russia with an official visit. This conversation with Putin will be related to the details of this visit.
Thank you for sharing. We've talked about the future of Russia, China, Ukraine. What about the future of NATO? We've seen a lot of friction now between Europe and the US. What do you see the future of European-US relations first, and then the future of NATO? And what is the purpose of NATO if Russia and the US are starting to get closer together again?
It's hard to imagine what will happen there. They have significant internal contradictions, and the Americans are well aware of this. The future of Europe can only be bright in alliance with Russia. If the Europeans, the European Union, established good, normal relations, at least economically on with Russia, they would thrive. But do the Americans want this? That's the question. Regardless, for the Americans, not only China and Russia, but also the European Union are competitors. Will America be great again? Well, it's written on Trump's hat. The question is, when will there be a strong European Union? Therefore, the European Union is also an economic competitor to the United States of America. That's why the unity of the European Union and Russia is... This unity probably wasn't entirely beneficial for the United States, but it would have been crucial for the world. Any system is stable if it rests on multiple support pillars. In our world, the United States serves as one pillar of support for our planet. China is the second pillar. The European Union, and it used to be a powerful entity with 600 million inhabitants and was technologically advanced, would be the third pillar. Russia and India. Even though there was less from them to shoulder, they still helped hold our planet up. If we rely solely on one pillar, the USA, there is a significant chance that this system will collapse. Holding it up with just two supports, China and the USA, will also be difficult. Therefore, the third pillar, in the form of the European Union, was crucial for the entire world. I believe that this third pillar cannot be destroyed. It must be preserved. It seems to me that, despite the incomprehensible policies pursued by the European Union, there will be sensible individuals who can save the EU and improve relations, including with us, Russia. Ukraine is too small to threaten the world we all inhabit. The USA, China, Russia, and Ukraine. It's too... The explosive power is too small. That's why we need to resolve the issues with Ukraine and in the Middle East. There it will be easier to achieve this if the Americans are willing to do so. And it seems to me that we will resolve these problems this year.
The last two questions, Mr. President. The first one is, where do you think we'll be today or next couple of years if former President Biden was still president?
Well, it's hard for me to imagine, but it seems to me that we would have been approaching a nuclear confrontation or a third world war. The election of Trump, at least as of today, the election of Trump has made it possible to avoid this extreme scenario. I think this applies not only to today. Trump appears to be a strong individual by nature, and it seems he is fulfilling his main promises regarding peace.
I've got two more last questions. The first one is a question on behalf of a friend of mine. So, not a friend, a client of ours. So I was just before coming to Belarus, I met a client and I didn't know he was born in Belarus, lives in Russia. And, I told him we'll be having this interview, and he asked me for a favor to ask that question.
Yeah.
Mr. President, we learned in 2020 that even if we disagree with our president, change is gradual and takes time and should not be forced through violence or revolution. Is there any chance you could turn a new page and give those who got a bit too excited a second chance, offering them a pardon, those that are exiled?
This is my task. We are already working on it. We do it. That is my task. The one who made a mistake, the one who was besotted, they must live in their homeland, build families and raise children. This is one of my responsibilities.
And last question, Mr. President, is I feel, especially after this discussion, but even before we had the opportunity to meet, being asked the same questions time and time again by the same people in the media didn't allow you to give your perspective to a Western audience. So my question to you is, what would be your message to Americans? What would be your message to Europeans that will be watching this?
To be honest, I didn't intend to say anything. Not for an American or European audience, but I can only wish for the United States of America, prosperity to the people of the United States, first and foremost, and secondly, what I mentioned, the implementation of specific plans that the new administration has laid out. I want Donald Trump to be an effective president. I want what Trump promises to the American people and to all of us to come true. I've already mentioned this, but it must be done. It has to be done every day. Time is running out. As for Europeans, listen, we live on the same continent. Belarus is the center of Europe. We have the center of Europe in Polotsk. Thus, Belarus is the heart of Europe. Everything follows from here. Therefore, I can say, as we often do, let's live in peace. Look around. There is such beauty here. This was created by our hands, and not only by ours, but also by the Lord. Let's preserve this for our children. This is the main thing. For me as well, you are quite a young man. I am already an established politician, a departing politician, a grown man. I have children, I have grandchildren. Why should I do anything harmful? I want to do good. I must do good. And I urge the Europeans and Americans to ensure that our children and grandchildren can live well, at least as well as we do. This is the main thing. It may sound pompous, but I do think so. And when you reach my age, you will think the same way.
Well, Mr. President, I really appreciate this discussion. I enjoyed it, and I hope your call with President Putin goes well as well. I know it's in 3 minutes, and you're a very punctual man. So thank you for your time, sir.